Welcome to the second video in our Ancient Egypt series. This time we're going to be focusing on ancient Egyptian geography. Before we do that though, it's really important to understand why we're looking at geography within history in year 7. We've already defined history as the study of the past based on evidence. So basically, people leave artifacts behind in the past, things, objects that we then discover. Those are primary source pieces of evidence. Some of that is interpreted by historians and other people. That's secondary evidence, and together that evidence is what we use to build a version of the past, a sort of story of the past. That's history. Geography is very closely related. It's the study of the physical features of planet Earth and of human activity as it affects and is affected by them. And what that means is, it's the study of features such as forests, rivers, mountains, deserts, and how we interact with them, why they're important to us, how we use them, and how we sort of have to adapt to them over time. Now, in the previous video, we looked at the idea of the Fertile Crescent and how it helped give rise to ancient Egyptian civilization. That Fertile Crescent was basically Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia in ancient Greek means the land between two rivers. In this case, the Tigris and the Euphrates, which is an amazing place. It's the cradle of civilization. This little bit of the Middle East basically had all of those staple crops and all of those animals that we domesticated around 8000 BC in the wild. It's the only place in the world where that's true, and probably is the reason why it's the only place where you get really the rise of human civilization as it happened. And some of the biggest cities of the ancient world were located directly in that area. Places like Babylon, for example. Now, the importance of geography to us in year 7 history is basically several different things. Firstly, it's vital to understanding how and why people live where they live. Why they chose to live along the River Nile is a really important thing to understand about the ancient Egyptians. It's important to understand how people live and work. Everything that we do is shaped by our environment. It's shaped by the geography that we're in. And for example, the ancient Egyptians weren't going to be good carpenters. They weren't going to be great at working with wood. Why? For the simple reason that there wasn't a lot of wood around. It's a very dry area, northern Egypt. Very dry, basically defined by desert. So a lot of those occupations, a lot of those things that people do when they're living in an environment that's, for example, mountainous or forested, or there's a lot of grassland, they can't do that in Egypt. And the ancient Egyptians didn't do that. It's important to understand how societies function. So, for example, cities are only a thing, can only exist in places with enough water and enough food to feed a lot of people in a really confined space. If you don't have those elements, you don't have a civilization, you don't have city living. And finally, it's important to understand because it tells us why some societies are successful and others are not. Societies that fail over time often do so because of their geography. One good example for Egypt is that it was really well protected from invasion by its geography. Not a lot of other peoples could attack it because they had to cross desert or cross a really sort of shallow land bridge, a narrow land bridge, like for example with the Sinai. And that geography meant that Egyptian civilization was sort of isolated for a long time and able to flourish on its own without interference by other people. Geography can tell us these things. Bottom line for us, you cannot understand ancient Egypt without knowing its geographic realities. Since those realities predate the ancient Egyptian civilization, that's where we got to start. We got to start looking at what geography meant to the ancient Egyptians. So, firstly and foremostly, here we have a sort of satellite image of North Africa. And the red rectangle on the right is, of course, Egypt itself and the River Nile. So the northern part of the red rectangle is modern Egypt, but the River Nile extends all the way from the bottom, which is Sudan and Ethiopia, and snakes its way northward until it gets to the Mediterranean Sea. You can also see a couple of other things immediately, just looking at the satellite image. For example, not a ton of green. If you look at any other part of this map, the globe, you could probably see a fair bit of green instead of this kind of yellow, orange, brown color that we see mostly encompassing the map. And the reason why is because most of this map is, of course, the Sahara Desert. This satellite image is of the Sahara Desert, which does not have a lot of plant life. As a result, from high on up, it looks really red, it looks really yellow, it looks really brown. These are the colors of the desert, and these are the colors of the mountains and hills that are sort of sprinkled throughout. Here we have a closer looking satellite image, so a little bit closer to the surface, and a couple of details start to stand out. One, along the river, which you can see in the middle of the screen there, you actually see something else. You see this kind of patch of green snaking its way up and then kind of exploding outward as it reaches the Mediterranean Sea. The reason why is because this is a floodplain. This is what happens when a river bursts its banks. It leaves really fertile soil behind where plants can flourish. And that's going to be really important when we look at Egyptian farming, because without this feature of the River Nile and other rivers like it, you cannot have people living there. It's almost impossible. So not only does the River Nile provide fresh water to people, it also provides them a place where they can grow crops, where they can raise crops, and before they know how to raise crops, at least they can gather some crops that grow naturally along the river. So over time, a civilization developed along the River Nile. Here we see some of its cities and landmarks, places like Heliopolis, Cairo, Memphis, Thebes, which was a capital for a really long time. You've got the deserts all around, the Western Desert, the Eastern Desert, the Nubian Desert, and some of the most important landmarks include the Valley of the Kings, the Temple of Luxor, the Pyramids of Giza, and the Great Pyramid of Giza there near the Nile River Delta. These things are next to the river for a really basic and a really important reason. This is the place that human beings inhabited. This, the arable land of Egypt, the place where you could grow crops, because you couldn't grow everywhere. Outside of that region, you've got essentially Deshret, the Red Land, which is desert. You can't grow things there. The only place you can grow stuff in ancient Egypt is, of course, Kemet, the Black Land, which is what they called it, a floodplain. That was amazing for growing crops. That made Egypt one of the best places to grow crops in the world. Another thing really important to understand is that it's a dry and arid climate, which means it doesn't rain a lot. It rains more in northern Egypt than southern, but that's not saying much. If you look at this image, for example, you see the precipitation, aka rainfall. You're looking at 6 millimeters per month on average at the maximum. There are days in Melbourne where you can get 50 mils in one day. One day. Compare this to Egypt, where the monthly maximum is 7 millimeters in January. It's not a lot of rain. So what does that mean for the ancient Egyptians? They had to depend on other sources of water, namely the Nile, which reinforces how important that river was. This was a tropical desert climate, which means it was real hot all year round. It's in the northern hemisphere, so summer months are June, July, and August. But look at the average temperatures in June, July, and August. You're looking at a maximum daily temperature of 30, or average daily temperature of 30 centigrade, 30 degrees Celsius, which is crazy. It's a very, very hot place. You can see the comparison to London, where London in July and August is averaging between 22, 23 Celsius. Egypt is much hotter. The key question that remains for us here with geography is, how does all this affect human habitation along the Nile, and how did it influence Egyptian civilization? In effect, it meant everything to the Egyptians. They called the Nile and the land that it created around it with the floodplains the gift of the Nile. Without the River Nile, there is no ancient Egyptian civilization, and the first step to understanding the Egyptians is understanding that vital fact about them. Without the Nile, they would never have existed. Even as something as simple as traveling would have been totally different without the Nile. They of course used the river to travel, but as you can see in this map, you've got the so-called cataracts of the Nile that at certain places, for example at Aswan, the first cataract, block travel by boat. They make it really hard because there are these stones, these little islands in the middle of the river that make travel by boat there very, very difficult. They create what are called rapids or whitewater. In this way, the Nile shapes all sorts of things about Egyptian civilization, where they go, where they live, how they farm, and how they survive. In fact, we know that about 10,000 years ago, the whole area was a lot more survivable. Well, from this graph, which you don't need to understand at any great length, we can see basically that all that desert land around the Nile used to be a lot greener. And unfortunately, over time, desertification took place, and basically North Africa became a lot more arid, a lot drier. There was a period of climate change that resulted in people having to leave the area and move closer and closer to the river itself in order to be able to survive. As such, geography and history are basically inextricable from each other. They're part of the same thing, the same study of human existence and how people live, how people survive, how people exist. So to start understanding the Egyptians, in truth, you have to understand their geographic realities. And in this case, the Nile River is at the heart of all of it. It's what we're going to be looking at for a major assessment for this topic, which is a little bit down the line and we won't talk about today. And it's the heart of everything we look at for ancient Egypt. So, good place to start. Important thing to understand. Make sure that you do the work that's been laid out for you in the lesson plans. And going forward, we're going to start digging a little bit deeper into ancient Egyptian history and how it was shaped by the Nile, how it was shaped by its geography, and its unique features. Thanks for listening. Have an awesome day.